I want to start today by sharing the story of a young lady, a hero to me and many, from the Chicago Police Department whom we lost last year. I've spoken about her before. Her name is Officer Ella French. Ella French joined the Chicago Police Department in 2018. By all accounts, she was an embodiment of selflessness. She loved people, she loved her family, she loved animals, and particularly stray dogs. She was known for picking them up in her squad car and ferrying them off to safety. She worked as part of the CPD's community safety team, a unit designed to build stronger ties with the communities that they served. Last year, sadly, Officer French made the ultimate sacrifice in her line of duty. She was shot and killed while making a traffic stop with her partners, Officer Carlos Yanez Jr. and Officer Joshua Blas. She was 29 years old. The gun that was used to kill her and to seriously injure Officer Yanez was straw purchased in Indiana. I'd like to show a brief video to help tell her story and the threats that law enforcement officers face. Please show the video.
The night of July 1st, there was a mass shooting in Inglewood on a day that had already seen a child shot on the south side. This one left a 1-month-old in critical condition. It was Officer Ella French who played a key role in saving the child's life, rushing the baby to the hospital. On Saturday night, French was killed in an ambush attack in Inglewood.
Straw purchase pistol was smuggled through an all-too-familiar pipeline, Indiana to Illinois.
Officer Ella French's mother looked out over a sea of blue while over 1,000 police officers cramming St. Rita Church.
A line of mourners, thousands deep, wrapped around the perimeter of the Southside Chapel.
Chicago's Archbishop described her connectedness, both to the community that she served and the people that she worked with.
She was just 29 years old. She hasn't even begun her life yet.
2 young police officers, both in their 20s, shot in the line of duty while responding to a domestic dispute.
A Detroit police officer shot and killed in the line of duty.
A police officer has been shot in Southeast Houston.
A North Kansas City police officer was shot during a traffic stop and has life-threatening injuries.
You never know. It can end in any minute. I mean, you could kiss your family goodbye, go to work, and, make a traffic stop, and it could be over in a heartbeat.
I'm not standing here reporting on a fist fight that keeps happening in and around our community. I'm reporting on double shootings, triple shootings.
At this point, the firearms are more dangerous than the drugs.
It's way too easy for people to use straw purchasers and get these kind of guns in their hands.
I want to protect citizens. I'm a protector. I want to protect my police officers, my own son, who's a police officer. And I think we can achieve both these objectives without infringing on anyone's rights.
We need to change. We need to change the system. Too many officers, innocent children, parents are being shot. This needs to stop.
Officer Ella French is remembered and beloved for her profound generosity and her passion for service. My wife and I went down to St. Rita Chapel to join in the memorial service. We have never seen an outpouring of grief like we saw that day. We joined hundreds, maybe thousands of mourners who were there. Ella's mother, Elizabeth French, is with us today. I want to thank her personally for being here and for honoring the legacy of her wonderful daughter. Officer French and her family remind us all of the sacrifice law enforcement officers make every time they put on a uniform. I met Officer Yanez at the Southside Irish Parade. He was in a golf cart with his dad and had a very positive spirit and determination to do everything possible in the rest of his life. With every disturbance call, every domestic violence incident, every 911 report of shots fired, officers put themselves in harm's way to protect us. Let me be clear, and I've said it many times before, I condemn all violence and threats of violence, whether it's Antifa on the left or Donald Trump's January 6th insurrectionists on the right. No political grievance can ever justify attacking police officers. And we should honor the service and sacrifice, not just with words, but with action. In May, this committee reported 5 bipartisan bills to increase federal support for officer hiring and retention and support for officers who suffer job-related trauma. Congress also significantly increased federal funding for state and local law enforcement in the March Omnibus Spending Bill, and more than $10 billion from last year's American Rescue Plan has been dedicated to community policing in over 300 communities. President Biden has called for further funding in his new Safer America plan. There are some on the other side who falsely accuse Democrats for wanting to defund the police. The record is clear. We are funding the police, and we should. But our work cannot end there. We cannot ignore the dominant role of guns in assault and killings of police officers. Our nation is awash in guns, estimating over 400 million firearms in our nation. Some of them, from straw-purchased handguns to assault weapons, can pierce the Kevlar vests that are supposed to protect law enforcement. At least one witness today has a personal experience with that. From 2012 through 2021, 456 law enforcement officers across America were killed in gun attacks. During the same period, 12 police officers were fatally shot in Canada. 4 were fatally shot in the United Kingdom. 3 were fatally shot in Australia. 456 in America, 12 in Canada, 4 in the United Kingdom, 3 in Australia. Guns are the second leading cause of officer line-of-duty deaths in America after COVID-19. Just last year in Illinois, we lost Bradley Police Sergeant Marlene Ritmanick, Wayne County Deputy Sheriff Sean Riley, Pontoon Beach Police Officer Tyler Timmons, Champaign Police Officer Christopher Overhelm, and Officer French to gun attacks. My heart goes out to each of their families and for their losses. We take an important step forward with last month's passage of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. It includes, finally, a provision that I've joined others in fighting for years, cracking down on straw purchasing. Today I'm announcing a new bill which would provide funding to multi-jurisdictional task forces that investigate and disrupt straw purchasing and illegal firearms trafficking. With the gracious permission of her family, the bill will be named after Officer French. We must do more than prevent officers from being shot. We must do more to prevent officers from being shot. Just last month, Chicago police officer Fernanda Ballesteros shot in the head while making a traffic stop. By the grace of God, she survived. In reflecting on her attacker, Officer Ballesteros said her situation demonstrates, quote, how quickly an officer's day can turn into something catastrophic. She's right. We have to do more to protect our law enforcement officers from the threats they face. And now I'll turn to my friend, Senator Grassley, for opening remarks.
First of all, a big thank you to Chairman Durbin for responding to my request to hold a hearing on this issue of danger to law enforcement officers. I appreciate it very much. Attacks on police officers are rising across the country. We see news stories on a regular basis about ambush attacks and murder of law enforcement in Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and elsewhere. Even in my home state of Iowa has not escaped this violence. Nationwide, 73 officers were killed in felonies last year, the highest number since the 9/11 attacks. That's a 59% increase over the previous year. 133 officers were shot in ambush-style attacks, an increase of 123% over the previous year. The most recent data shows that violent crime is rising across our country, but violence against police officers is even higher. This is a unique and a very critical problem, and this hearing recognizes that, and once again, thank Senator Durbin for bringing attention to this part of crime in the United States that doesn't get the attention it should. So I recognize one of my guests here today is Officer Zach Anderson. He was deputy in Grundy County last year when Sergeant Jim Smith of Iowa State Patrol was murdered in an ambush attack. He was with Sergeant Smith when the murder happened. I previously spoke in honor of Sergeant Smith's memory on the Senate floor. It breaks everybody's heart to hear stories like this come out of our state. but there's sadly many such stories around the country. Every death of an officer killed in the line of duty ought to be considered a tragedy. It's a tragedy for the officer who sacrificed his or her life. It's a tragedy for families and friends left behind. It's a tragedy for the community that lost a public servant. And it's a tragedy for all of us who rely on brave men and women to keep us safe. There's another disturbing trend that goes hand in hand with the rise in attack on police. We see more criminals resisting or fleeing arrest, more disrespect and demonizing of law enforcement, and a general atmosphere of hostility towards the people in uniform who put their lives on the line to protect us. This is a growing crisis, and there much that Congress needs to do to help address it. Senator Durbin talked about a bill he's putting in. I would raise one of the challenges in legislation that I'm introducing, a lack of data that backs up how bad this problem really is. While the government collects basic data on attack against police that result in serious injury or death, we don't have much data on contributing factors. We also don't have good data on attacks against police that don't result in death or serious injury. For this reason, I introduced a bill that I entitled Improving Law Enforcement Officer Safety and Wellness Through Data Act. This bill will help expand our understanding of these attacks to better identify motives, identify trends, and any coordinated efforts to target those officers who put on the badge to keep our country safe. I worked with police groups, including Major County Sheriff's Association, the National Association of Police Officers, to identify gaps in reporting. Senators Lujan, Tillis, Hassan, and Cassidy are original co-sponsors of this bipartisan bill. There are several bills proposed by members of this committee that would make it a federal crime to attack law enforcement, and that would enhance penalties to do so. Senators Cornyn, Tillis, and Cotton have sponsored those bills. A main cause of this violence against police is the demonization and the disrespect shown to the profession of law enforcement throughout the country. When you allow hatred of a group to spread, people find it easy to justify violent attacks against law enforcement. Kathy Smith, the wife of the late Sergeant Smith that I've already spoken about, sent us a letter that I'd like to introduce into the record. She tells us about what a wonderful and self-serving man Sergeant Smith was, but also that over the past 6 to 8 years, he told her that officers have been treated with more hostility. She writes that during the riots, quote, "My husband stood with his tactical team protecting the state capitol in Iowa and had frozen water bottles and rocks thrown at them. Protesters spit and insulted them for hours at a time," end quote. I held a round table a couple months ago with Iowa law enforcement in Davenport, Iowa, and one theme that I heard constantly is that officers' recruitment and retention is a major problem. There aren't enough police officers to go around. There's not enough young people joining the profession. Most new hires they're seeing come from other law enforcement offices. So one department gains a person, another department loses a person. The question that comes up is how we can ask young people to join the profession if we don't take care of them. How can we ask them to protect us if we don't protect them? And if we don't have enough officers we can only expect to see other violent crimes get worse and worse. Kathy Smith's message to us here today is this, quote, "You can allow culture's diminishing respect and police lack of protection to continue down this dark path, permitting more families to face the same shattered fate as ours, or you can do something about it. You can listen to the problems we have, develop a plan to fix them, and save the lives of our officers." End of Kathy's quote. I agree with Kathy, and I hope this hearing will help to examine all aspects of this crisis for police and how we can help protect them. Before I close, I'd like to introduce into the committee a letter from the National Association of Police Organizations and also a statement from the Fraternal Order of Police, which states that anti-police rhetoric amplified by social media platforms leads to brazen acts of violence against them. I thank all of our witnesses for testifying. Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. We certainly will include Mrs. Smith's letter and the others which you referenced.
Thank you.
We're joined today by a distinguished panel. We'll introduce them and swear them in, and then each witness will have 5 minutes for an opening statement. Senators can follow up with their own 5 minutes of questioning. I'll briefly introduce three of today's witnesses and then turn to Senator Grassley for introductions before the administration of the oath. Our first witness is Angel Navales, who serves as Chief of Constitutional Policing and Reform for the Chicago Police Department. He has served CPD for 21 years, including serving as Watch Operations Lieutenant in the 25th District, Commanding Officer of the Neighborhood Policing Initiative, Deputy Chief of Community Policing. He's a graduate of Calumet College, and is currently pursuing a master's degree in public safety from St. Xavier University. Chief Navales, thank you for your service to the city and for being here today. Michael Harrison is a commissioner of the Baltimore Police Department, a position he's held since 2019. Current president of the Police Executive Research Forum, or PERF. Before serving in Baltimore, he served in New Orleans, in their police department for nearly 3 decades, rising through the ranks and becoming the superintendent there for over 4 years. He has a Master's of Criminal Justice from Loyola University, New Orleans, and he's also a graduate of Northwestern University School of Police Staff and Command. Commissioner Harrison, thank you for your service and thanks for being here today. Dwight Henninger has served as the Chief of the Vail, Colorado Police Department since 2002, current president of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, member of the IACP Executive Committee for 8 years. 2010, he was congressionally appointed to serve on the local, state, tribal, and federal preparedness task force directed by FEMA. Has a master's degree from the University of California, Irvine, and San Diego State. Thank you for your service and joining us today. Senator Grassley, please introduce your witnesses.
Okay, I have two to introduce. Officer Zachary Anderson works for the Cedar Falls Public Safety Office. He was a deputy in the Grundy County Sheriff's Office in April 2021, and he was there when Iowa State Patrol Sergeant Jim Smith, who was murdered in an ambush attack. It also happens that Zach attends the same church as I do in Cedar Falls, Iowa, Prairie Lakes Church. Officer Anderson has worked in law enforcement since 2017, received the Certification of Extraordinary Personal Action from the American Red Cross for using life-saving skills in medical emergency. Before that, he worked helping juveniles at the Eldora State Training School. We thank him for his service and for testifying today. My next introduction is Sheriff Mike Bouchard. Runs one of the largest sheriff offices in America in Oakland County, Michigan. He has served as sheriff there since 1999 and has a total of 35 years of law enforcement. The sheriff is vice president of the government affairs at the Major County Sheriffs of America Association, where he has also served as president. He was also appointed to President Donald Trump's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice Working Group. in 2020. Sheriff Bouchard has received so many honors and awards that I can only name a few. He was named Sheriff of the Year 2022 by Michigan Sheriff's Association, and in 2016 by the National Sheriff's Association. He earned a Silver Star for bravery from the American Police Hall of Fame and much more. Sheriff, thank you for appearing to testify today.
I believe Senator Cornyn is going to introduce the next witness, Sergeant Penny.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to express my appreciation to both Senator Durbin and Grassley for holding this important hearing. The rise in anti-police rhetoric in the summer of 2020, the progressive prosecutor movement, and COVID lockdowns and the lack of criminal prosecutions have emboldened criminals across the board. It's been especially deadly when it comes to uniformed law enforcement officers. As of June 2022, according to the Fraternal Order of Police, there have already been 178 law enforcement officers shot in the line of duty, which is a 19% increase from 2021. And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to introduce the monthly update from the Fraternal Order of Police, which indicates those figures at the end of my introduction.
Without objection.
Thank you. So, as we can see, this hearing is long overdue. Today, I'm pleased to introduce a fellow Texan, Trey Penny, who's a sergeant, but also, I see, a doctor. Got a doctorate from Texas Tech University. But more to the point, at the age of 16, Sergeant Penny experienced a personal tragedy that would shape the trajectory of his life when his cousin was shot and killed a day before her wedding. This experience and the officer's response to that tragedy put him on a path to protecting and serving our communities. Originally he served in the Army. He served 4 years and simultaneously graduated with an associate degree in Administration of Justice from Honolulu Community College. Sergeant Penny then made his way back to Texas and joined the Dallas Police Department, where he eventually rose to the rank of sergeant. While serving on the force, he continued his education and obtained multiple advanced degrees, including a bachelor's degree in criminal justice from Midwestern, master's degree in counseling from Prairie View A&M, and the doctorate of education from Texas Tech. In July of 2016, Dallas, Texas experienced a horrific attack on our law enforcement officers when a deranged gunman shot and killed 5 officers and injured 9 others. And at the time, Mr. Chairman, Chief Brown, who's now chief of the Chicago Police Department, was chief of the Dallas Police Department, where I met him at the time. Sergeant Penny used this unspeakable loss to fuel his efforts to stand up for his fellow officers and their families. He now serves as a president and executive director of the National Fallen Officers Association and has worked tirelessly to bridge the gap between police and the communities they serve, helping raise awareness for fallen officers and their families, and he's advocated for policy changes that would protect law enforcement and provide financial assistance to the family of those fallen officers. Sergeant Penny, I want to thank you for being here today and thank you for your service.
Thank you, Senator Cornyn. I ask all the witnesses to please rise and raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give before the committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you very much. Let the record reflect that all of the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. You will each have 5 minutes for an opening statement, starting with Chief Navales.
Good morning, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and committee members. My name is Angel Navales, and I serve as the Chief of Constitutional Policing and Reform for the Chicago Police Department. Thank you. Thank you very much for holding this hearing. I'm honored to represent the Chicago Police Department and to speak on behalf of those who often feel unheard, those sons, those daughters, those mothers, those fathers behind the badge, risking their lives every day to protect our communities. Policing is a dangerous job, and while it is our job to protect our communities, we cannot underestimate the emotional toll it has on our officers. We're the ones responding to victims, processing crime scenes, taking those images home with us, and putting that uniform back on the very next day. Those experiences, they stay with us forever, bearing an impact words can never express. Not every officer is physically injured in a violent encounter, but every officer endures the emotional scars of repeated exposure to violence. And this is one of the toughest times to wear the badge. This year alone, Chicago police officers have been shot at 36 times, with 7 of those struck by gunfire. In the last 2.5 years, our officers have taken more than 24,000 guns off the streets of Chicago. I'm joined today by my fellow officers, including Deputy Chief Patrina Wines, who last year was shot in the line of duty. I'm also joined by Ms. Elizabeth French, the mother of our fallen hero, Officer Ella Grace French. Almost 1 year ago today, Officer French and her partner, Officer Carlos Yanes Jr., were shot in the line of duty. Officer French lost her life to the wounds she sustained, and each day Officer Yanes and his family continue to heal from and adapt to his catastrophic and lasting injuries. Officer Joshua Blas, Ella's partner and friend, sprang into action and helped to save Officer Yanes' life. Although Joshua did not sustain a gunshot wound, the emotional toll he will have to endure from that incident cannot be overstated. These are the moments we know can happen, but we hope they never happen. Ella was a source of light and joy for all who knew her. Her partner Carlos remarked that she was beautiful inside and out. Josh shared her love of animals and how she lived to help others. Her friends say her bubbly spirit was a constant, no matter the situation. Carlos comes from a police family, and his colleagues have always admired his determination. In fact, when his doctor told him he'd never be able to use the left side of his body, Carlos said, "I accept that challenge." He danced with his wife in March of this year. Carlos continues to recover with his family and remains a source of inspiration for our department. Early in my career, my partner and I were responding to a call of a woman crying for help. We encountered an offender with a gun. I ordered him to drop that weapon. He lowered his weapon as if he was about to drop it when suddenly he fired a round in my direction. I still remember the look on his face before he fired, and I felt around before I heard the shot. I thought my vest had absorbed the bullet. What I didn't realize was the bullet pierced through the side of my chest and traveled and collapsed my lungs. I radioed my location, and later I learned that I had inadvertently radioed my mother's home address. The injuries sustained from this incident remain with me today professionally, physically, and in the private corners of my mind. I still struggle with my wounds, as many officers around the country are struggling from their injuries, the injuries they've sustained, and the traumatic human experiences they witness every single day on the job. They do this while trying to balance the realities of the noble profession with their everyday lives. You can't exaggerate the impact that our experiences with crime and violence has on us. Protecting those that protect us has to be a priority. I can't help to think about Officer French and all the officers whose families have been left without them. I think about Ms. French when she shared how Ella became a police officer to make communities safer, and her response to today's hearing by saying, quote, "It was important to Ella Grace to get as many weapons off the streets as possible. Her death and that of so many other innocent people are why we must keep working to get guns off the streets. It is a piece of the puzzle, and the reason that I'm willing to be here is to help something good come out of the death of my dear daughter, Ella Grace," end quote. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share with all of you here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Chief Navales, and thank you so much for your service.
Thank you.
Officer Anderson.
Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and the distinguished members of the panel, thank you for providing me with the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Zach Anderson. I'm a public safety officer with Cedar Falls, Iowa. I want to share with you today a recent experience that unfortunately is not dissimilar to too many of my brothers and sisters in law enforcement. On April 9th, 2021, I was working with my former agency as a sheriff's deputy in Grundy County, Iowa. My evening started off like normal with a few calls and traffic stops. I then stopped for dinner, and I heard a call come out that an officer was in a pursuit. That situation worsened as I learned the officer involved had been assaulted, and I quickly responded in that direction. The suspect fled to his residence in the city of Grundy Center and was followed by a fellow deputy. I arrived on scene shortly after the suspect had barricaded himself in his residence. Many additional officers arrived on scene and countless attempts were made at all entrances to call him out of his house, saying, "We don't want to hurt you, come out with your hands up." Unfortunately, all these attempts were met with no response. We did not know if the suspect was alive, awake, or okay. The responding agencies on scene met and formulated a plan of entry into the home. Leading that plan was Sergeant Jim Smith, a leader with the Iowa State Patrol Tactical Team. It was decided to first send a canine in to clear the basement of the residence. That was completed and officers began knocking, announcing the impending entry of the canine to the main level of the home. The suspect ambushed us when the next door was opened. He was waiting for us with a shotgun. He fired 2 shots, striking and killing Sergeant Smith. The suspect retreated into his home. I remember shouts, "Jim, Jim," of Trooper Matt Lively calling out to provide care and remove him from the garage. 2 officers were trapped in the basement, and the subject began making threats to kill us all. "Come in and start shooting. I'll kill you like I killed your buddy." I was nice. I shot him in the chest, but come sunup, I won't be so nice. I'll shoot you in the face. The words I heard and the events I witnessed will be with me for the rest of my life. Not a day goes by that it doesn't cross my mind. Today I can tell you that I'm doing okay, but I know others are not. Actions need to be taken to protect those of us in this line of work. We need to have the right support and resources opposing defund the police. The image of an officer has been tarnished in recent years. The rhetoric used by the media doesn't do us any favors with clickbait headlines of what an officer did or didn't do without painting the rest of the picture. We take an oath to do our best for the communities we protect. The men and women I have had the opportunity to work with stand behind the promise daily. The suspect in the tragedy I was involved in ramped up his hatred towards law enforcement, and it got much worse with the way of the world. And he had one goal that day, and he succeeded in achieving. I did question if I wanted to continue in this field as a direct result of this incident. Is it worth it? What is being done to support us after a major incident like this? We need to prioritize resources for officers, have people to talk to, debriefings, trainings. Not all officers will get the help they need. So there needs to be steps in place so that they don't fall through the cracks. I am grateful my wife encouraged me to talk, but not everyone has the same support or will open up to those closest to them. Events like this also take a toll on families, and they also need to be supported. My wife knew that night I was supposed to be home, but had been called into emergency. Being from a small community, the word travels fast, and she heard that an officer was shot and killed and had not heard from me. She knew where I was, but my GPS hadn't moved for hours. She sat a long time that night in the unknown. She's since struggled with survivor's guilt because she knows the relief of knowing that I was okay and coming home, and the harsh reality that that wasn't the case for another Iowa family. On April 9th, 2021, Kathy Smith lost her husband. Xander and Jaslyn lost their father, and a law enforcement family lost their brother. Sergeant Smith made an ultimate sacrifice, and from all that I have learned about him, that he was the leader he wouldn't have had it any other way but to be sent in first to protect his men. I ask you today to lead like Jim by defending us, protecting us, caring for us, and validating the work we do as law enforcement officers. We talk about holding that line, the thin blue line, serving and protecting those in need. We need our families, our friends, and our communities, and our nation's leaders to have our backs as we fight to hold that line, because without that support, that line cannot be held. Thank you.
Thank you, Officer Anderson, for that powerful testimony. Commissioner Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee for the opportunity to testify before you today. Serving as a member of law enforcement is not just a profession. It is a calling. In my 32 years of experience as a police officer and in my 8 years as a police executive in 2 major cities, I've witnessed firsthand the challenges that members of the policing profession face on a daily basis. As president of the Police Executive Research Forum, I'm also part of a network of police executives in major cities, in medium-sized and small cities, who share with me their accounts of the work they are doing to combat gun violence in their jurisdictions. The proliferation of illegal guns and the availability of those illegal guns in nearly every major American city, county, town, and jurisdiction is a significant and direct factor in why we've seen an upward trend in gun violence across this country. In addition to the proliferation and availability of guns, we are severely challenged with today's offenders' mindset and willingness to use a firearm to enact violence on others, sometimes shooting indiscriminately into a crowd in an attempt to strike one person, sometimes in the proximity and even the presence of a police officer, and then at other times shooting directly at police officers. This is an environment in which our officers wake up every day, put on their uniforms, arrive at roll calls, and go out to protect and serve the communities they're sworn to protect. If I could take a personal moment, I want to highlight one such officer from the Baltimore Police Department. Officer Keyana died 1 week after being shot in an ambush-style attack while she was in her patrol vehicle. While the tragedy of her death brings into stark relief the danger our officers face, it is the story of her life that exemplifies what we want in our officers, the kind of service we ask of them, the kind of person she swears an oath and enters the profession to police. She joined our department in 2019 and did so because she wanted to serve her city and protect its communities. Even during her time at our police academy, she gave a powerful testimony of the need to improve police-community relations and her passion to serve. On the night she was shot, she was picking up a voluntary overtime shift in patrol. She was where she was supposed to be, providing visibility in an area that had been seeing a significant level of gun violence. Confronting the national challenge of gun violence must have a multi-layered approach that involves more than just law enforcement. We must invest in historically disinvested communities. We must provide wraparound services to victims of violence and intervene with them to prevent retaliatory violence. We must invest in violence prevention programs, intervention programs, drug rehabilitation programs, reentry programs, and so much more to provide individuals with pathways away from violent crime. But even when cities are engaged in all of these programs, doing all they can, the sheer volume of illegal guns and the trafficking of those guns in our community make it very difficult for officers to perform their duties safely. It's having an impact on the rate of officer separations and retirements. It's having an impact on the rate of recruitment of new officers. And because of these staffing impacts, it's having a significant impact on overall deployment strategies that could enhance officer safety and create safer communities. Officers are doing great work in seizing illegal guns and holding accountable those who commit gun violence. But let's be clear. In many cases, the number of guns outnumber the populations in some cities. And with police departments facing staffing challenges, the impact we can have on reducing gun violence is further diminished. Recent passage of federal legislation on guns is certainly a welcome, and additional investment in law enforcement investigative resources can certainly serve as a force multiplier for local police departments. In addition, I refer you to PERF's 9 recommendations found in our PERF publication entitled Reducing Gun Violence, What Works, What Can Be Done Now. We welcome this support and greatly value the coordinated efforts of agencies like FBI, DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshals, HSI, and other U.S. Department of Justice agencies. As police officers, we take an oath and we are trained to protect, serve under very difficult circumstances. We're called to be guardians and work in cooperation with the communities we protect. I am constantly impressed by the achievements of police officers who perform this duty with distinction and honor, knowing full well the danger they could face when they put on that uniform each day. I again thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Thanks, Commissioner. Sergeant Penny.
Thank you, Senator. On behalf of law enforcement officers across this country, I'm honored to appear before this committee to speak on a topic that's near and dear to my heart, protecting our police and protecting our communities. According to the FBI, 2021 marked the highest number of law enforcement officers murdered in more than 2 decades. Of the 633 line-of-duty deaths last year, there were 73 felonious killings. That should come to no surprise to anyone, especially considering the coordinated efforts that were used to undermine our police. As the chance to defund the police got louder, more police officers died and families were left to pick up the pieces. The rise in anti-police sentiment has led to a rash of attacks on police officers nationwide. In 2021 alone, there were 86 premeditated ambush-style attacks. So far in 2022, there have been 35, and this trend doesn't appear to be slowing anytime soon. So how did we get here? In 2014, the Ferguson riots gave rise to a new paradigm of violence against our police under the pretext Black Lives Matter. Although many people from churches and schools and inner city communities just wanted to peacefully protest, radical groups and extremists had a different agenda. It didn't matter whether the police were right or wrong. The Black Lives Matter organization saw an opportunity to exploit high-profile incidents involving the police to fundraise and further their radical agenda. For me, it was undeniable what Black Lives Matter was doing, because they were pulling directly from the black nationalist playbook, which overlooked violent crime in the black communities but magnified incidents involving the police. I was very familiar with this tactics because they were similar to the tactics that black nationalists used in the early 1990s in Houston, Texas, when I grew up as a teenager. The only difference was that Black Lives Matter used social media instead of a bullhorn microphone to amplify their radical message. Some of the rioting tactics used in the early 90s included organizing protests late in the evening and encouraging people to wear dark clothing so they can hide their criminal behavior. They understood that police were limited in their responses and capabilities, so they used diversionary tactics to distract police and cause more damage, looting, violence, and destruction. They also knew how to use media to manipulate the message and turn everyone against the police. I warned about this threat early on, but no one would listen because of the race dynamic. Even after the July 7, 2016 attack in Dallas, Texas that claimed the lives of 5 police officers, 4 of which were personal friends, no one would listen. By the summer of 2020, Black Lives Matter had escalated into full-blown riots, coinciding with the George Floyd murder. Realizing that police officers were at a disadvantage, other fringe anarchist groups around the country began waging attacks against police officers as well. We saw that especially in cities like Minneapolis, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Cleveland, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle, and Kenosha. The riots were uncontrollable. Police agencies didn't have the resources or manpower to deal with the mobs, nor did they know who was friend or foe. Police were essentially forced in an unattainable situation because the rules of engagement were imbalanced. On June 5th, 2020, Washington, D.C. Mayor approved to have the words Black Lives Matter painted on 16th Street leading to the White House. The message ended with defund the police. The defund the police message became the rallying cry for radicals across the country to protest and riot and loot across this country. In response to the defund the police movement, cities and across this nation began cutting budgets in solidarity with the movement. The lack of support for police led to police officers resigning, retiring, and many withdrawing from our police academies. As violent crime spiked in our inner cities, police agencies struggled to maintain their rates. Due to the high attrition rate, police officers were required to work extra shifts to compensate for the lack of manpower. The reduction in resources and low morale increased mental health problems for law enforcement officers. The combination of these factors led to overwhelming stress on these police officers, which resulted in higher suicide rates. The defund the police movement is also responsible for the overcorrection by these progressive DAs in their refusal to prosecute criminals. Police officers nationwide have expressed their frustration with having to arrest the same criminals over and over again because of no bail initiatives. The defund the police movement has done more damage than anyone can imagine. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergeant Penny. Chief Henninger.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Durbin, Ranking Member Grassley, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. Let me start by saying the focus of this hearing is very personal to me. When I started my career 40 years ago, I was shot and one of my partners was killed by a convicted felony motorcycle gang member with a handgun. 2 citizens were also severely injured by this felon. This experience has influenced my career and the life since that terrible night. I've made my primary mission to provide the safest working environment for my officers and to provide the tools and training to each of them to make sure they go home safely to their families at the end of their shift. This is not always possible, and probably the greatest fear for a chief is leading their agency through the loss of an officer. Tragically, my story is not unique, as you've heard today. We know that when we take the oath to serve, that our jobs are dangerous. However, this does not mean that we don't need and deserve adequate support. I appreciate the committee holding this hearing and highlighting the ways we can further support our officers. Far too many officers have witnessed the death of a colleague or suffered physical injuries and psychological trauma that are resulting from their jobs. We only need to look to the statistics you've already heard. In 2021, 83% of the officers were killed by gunfire. To provide a glimpse into 22, you've heard also that there's nearly a 20% increase. These officers are mothers, fathers, sisters, brothers who devote their life to public service. Considering these statistics, the sad reality is that every police officer must approach every encounter with the thought that the person could possibly have a gun. I cannot underscore the level of stress and the daily toll that takes on us and our families. The IACP, which I'm the president of, commends the bipartisan group of senators for their leadership in passing the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. While I believe this legislation is a step to reduce gun violence, more needs to be done. Progress cannot stop, and it is imperative that we identify workable solutions to dramatically reduce the 40,000 Americans who die each year from gun violence. The IACP is committed to the safety of our communities and the officers that serve them. Congress has taken the initial action, and now it's time for police officers, the criminal justice system, and the public to act. For our part, the IACP will be working with our members to ensure that they are prepared to enforce the new provisions targeting straw purchases, sharing information and investigative attempts by prohibited individual purchasers, and promoting the adoption of state-level red flag laws. We will also continue to work closely with our brothers at the FBI and ATF. However, this cannot solely be a law enforcement responsibility. It also must fall upon the rest of the criminal justice system. History has shown us that we can't wait to only punish repeat offenders, but need to make it clear that the first crime committed with a firearm has severe repercussions. Our criminal justice system owes our communities nothing less. We are constantly hearing frustration from our members regarding the challenges in prosecutorial direction and decisions, and how this can be directly attributed to the rise in violent crime. By this we mean when prosecutors enact blanket policies not to prosecute certain crimes and take non-enforcement approaches to the laws enacted. While prosecutorial decisions and discretion are a tenet of our judicial system, there must be alignment between the police and prosecutors to ensure agreement on the enforcement and prosecution of offenses. If prosecutors are disconnected from the police and the laws they enforce, the public loses faith in the system and the rule of law. The IACP also supports Congress to increase resources to better allow state and local law enforcement and the DOJ to enable greater prosecution of individuals for Brady Act violations. In addition, the IACP supports firearm projects such as Project Safe Neighborhood and Project Exile. Studies have shown that firearms offenders have the highest recidivism rate for committing other firearms-related violent crimes, more than even sexual offenders. Therefore, the IACP supports creating a federal registry like the Sex Offender Registry for offenders who have been previously convicted of a felony firearms violation or a misdemeanor that involves violent or threatening acts with firearms. This registry would have great benefit towards investigating violent crimes, as well as establishing a list of dangerous offenders who could establish a notification system to alert officers of that potential danger during a contact. The instances of gun thefts from unlocked cars and homes from lawful gun owners has seen a significant increase and is contributing to guns getting into the hands of juveniles and criminals. There needs to be a concerted effort to educate citizens to lock up their firearms. Beyond the increases in gun violence, we are facing increased opioid overdoses and community mental health crisis. Police today take on more roles and responsibilities than ever. On any given day, our shift, the officer may save a life with Narcan, console a family with a suicide loss, and de-escalate a situation to get a person into crisis, into mental health services. As police officers are doing more to protect their communities, they're feeling less and less appreciated. Officers deal with media and portrayals that only highlight the bad and community anger at the very idea of the police. It is not an easy time to be a police officer. Stress is high and morale is often low. And yet in the face of these challenges, officers show up every day dedicated to doing their job, building trust, and preventing crime, supporting victims, and keeping our communities safe. They enter this position because they care, and they stay because of it. We owe it to these officers to reduce their burdens and help them cope with the stressors of this dangerous and demanding job. I am proud of the ISP being in the forefront of changing the narrative around law enforcement mental health and wellness. Through the National Consortium on Preventing Law Enforcement Suicide, ISCP convenes a multidisciplinary group of leading experts to continually assess and address evolving law enforcement mental health needs through evidence-based recommendations and resources. The ISCP's Law Enforcement Resilience Training and the Valor Program have reached hundreds of officers to help them learn the skills they need to navigate adversity, grow, and thrive in the face of this job. The new Police Academy curriculum on officer safety and wellness will be made available nationwide to ensure that officers have the tools they need to have long and healthy careers. We commend the DOJ for continuing to expand funds for Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act. This fund has helped many agencies implement peer support and wellness services. However, there are many agencies that do not have the training and resources they need to provide their support. Congress should consider increasing the resources available for this act. Finally, in addition to taking care of the current officers, we need to address the hiring gap to reduce the stresses on law enforcement agencies and individual officers. We urge you to expand the COPS hiring funds and explore ways to incentivize careers in law enforcement and promote recruiting, retention through a national campaign, loan forgiveness, and educational incentives. In conclusion, our officers face threats daily. Our officers deserve our support, whether through the enactment of legislation that keeps guns out of the hands of criminals, a commitment by all members of the criminal justice system to effectively investigate and prosecute all violent and gun-related crimes, or providing officers with the assistance, resources, and tools they need to keep them safe. I urge you to use your position to pass meaningful legislation and will further safeguard our communities and our officers. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Chief. Sheriff Bouchard.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Grassley, thank you for your invitation to testify today and for your bipartisan focus on officer safety. After nearly 40 years in law enforcement, including 23 as sheriff, a board member of Major County Sheriffs of America, I could not agree with you more on how critical this issue is. Last week, an officer in Rochester, New York, was shot and killed in an ambush while on patrol. And this past weekend in Missouri City, Texas, was shot in the face while responding to a carjacking. And Deputy Yates in Harmony, Ohio, was killed going on a welfare check. Several deputies in my own department have sustained significant injuries being assaulted in just the last week. In my agency alone in 2021, we had 32 deputies significantly assaulted in line of duty. So far this year, with only 6.5 months into, we have already had 31 deputies assaulted. We've seen a significant increase in resisting arrest. Last year, we saw 216 in my agency, and so far, we've already seen almost 140 this year. I know our situation is not unique. While the overwhelming majority of daily contacts with the community are positive, the number of assaults on officers are up. The reasons behind this trend are complex, but respect for fellow citizens, respect for authority, seems to have greatly diminished in our society. We also have to acknowledge the demonization of police has added to this problem greatly. As much as we know about the assault, statistics don't tell the full picture, because use of force against officers is significantly underreported. For example, if a person resists arrest, and in that struggle, the officer is knocked down or bitten, there is rarely a record of the assault unless they sustain significant injury. In that situation, even though the officer was simply overcoming resistance to do their job and get it done, the stats may reflect 1 instance of officer use of force and 0 instance of use of force against the officer. In addition, most of these actions are successfully de-escalated every day, with our deputies getting no credit for it in the public eye. So, Mr. Chairman, it is clear to me we need to do a better job of collecting and reporting data on use of force against officers so we can better understand the trends and inform our training. That's why I support Senator Grassley's bipartisan legislation, the Improving of Law Enforcement Officer Safety and Wellness through Data Act. It would lead to more comprehensive data collection. Anyone who signs up for this job knows they will face physical violence at some point. But even though violence is part of the job, that does not mean we have to accept it. We have to constantly work to counter it, to de-escalate it if possible, to discourage it, to deter it, but to make sure people responsible for it face real consequences. I also believe it's critically important that we speak with one loud and united voice to make clear to the public that the place to fight police is not on the street. The place to fight criminal charges is not on the street, but in a courtroom. You may all remember last November when 4 students were murdered and 7 others injured in a shooting at Oxford High School in my county. Hundreds of my deputies from my agency responded to the threat, and the gunman was neutralized within a few minutes of our deputies' arrival. After the shooting, I flew in experts from across the country for a critical incident stress debrief for all personnel that responded to the incident to help them cope with a tremendous amount of trauma. I watched my deputies go into that debrief hollowed out and drawn. They were drained. Just a few days after that active shooter, a call came out across the radio while I was attending the wake of a student killed in the Oxford High School shooting. I responded to a large office building alongside my deputies. It was clear many of them on that scene had also responded to the school just days earlier. Yet there they were, rushing into another potentially life-threatening situation to do their job the community expects. I tell this story to illustrate how we must provide support to the officers and deputies who are subjected to violence, whether it's trauma from a massive incident like Oxford High School shooting or assaults they endure outside the headlines. We have to support them with the resources, training, and mental health services that allow them to recover from this trauma. One way Congress can help is by providing more funding for the Valor program, which is administered by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today and for your attention to this critical issue. I encourage the committee to sustain the focus on helping our deputies and officers on the front lines, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Sheriff Bouchard, and thanks to all the witnesses. I guess I pause at this point and think to myself, how many doors have we opened to talk about with your testimony? There's so many elements here. Some of us want to address what's on the mind of the shooter, and that's certainly relevant, important, worthy of our time. Some of us want to address what's in the hand of the shooter. What weapon do they bring to terrify or to assault a police officer? They're both relevant. And there's no question that there are elements of it that are politically controversial and we disagree on this panel. I've met Chief Navales with members of the Chicago Police Department off the record. I met at the training academy and said, come on in. We're going to spend whatever time you want to spend here, and you can say whatever you want to this politician. What's going on in the ranks? 20 of them showed up out of nowhere. Some had been on the force 2 years, some had been over 20. Black, white, and brown, women, men, they all came because they wanted to tell me something. They wanted me to be educated by the people who are risking their lives every single day. It was a valuable exchange. And then I've met with Noble, the Black Officers Organization, several different times. I've never run into a policeman who has made an excuse for what happened to George Floyd, nor Laquan McDonald. They just don't. And I think we ought to start with that premise, that good policemen know when things go wrong too, and they're honest about it. The same thing is true when it comes to the weaponry that's involved in this here. It's hard for me to understand, many of you have already mentioned this, Commissioner Harrison, you have as well, that there are so many firearms out there now. Chicago is awash in firearms. Many came from Illinois, but others came from states surrounding Illinois with much different standards in terms of sales. And we know from Highland Park and other places that AR-15s are becoming a common weapon used against police and innocent civilians. We think there are 10 to 20 million of these assault rifles that have been sold in this country. We are truly awash in weaponry. So I guess I'm going to start with Commissioner Harrison. Commissioner, you've seen this firsthand. Some people argue if we just give more Americans guns that they can carry, we will be safer. I question that. Whether you're a policeman or a member of our military, you need to be trained in the use of a weapon to be effective with that weapon. Even if we wanted to have more people carrying weapons to protect the police, what are your thoughts in terms of this proliferation of firearms? Do you have your microphone turned on?
Thank you for that question. I have not seen, working in 2 major American cities, nor have I heard from my colleagues in small, medium, and large-sized departments that more people carrying guns make them safe. What I can tell you is that with tough gun laws in the state of Maryland, where one has to have a permit to carry a gun outside of the home, in every year that we've exceeded more than 300 murders, more 335 last year, we're on pace for that again this year. None of those murders in my city and any other cities are committed by a person who has the lawful right to carry a gun. It's the unlawful carrying of guns with the illegal guns that are used in those crimes. And if there are justifiable cases, they're rare, and that number is very small. And so we're not seeing, we use data to answer those questions. The data does not support that more legal, law-abiding citizens carrying guns makes us safer, because we're not seeing that those individuals who can lawfully carry a gun are using those guns in self-defense, are being used in any other crimes. It's repeat violent offenders. It is the large number of guns on the street that are being bought on the street. Some are being bought, many are being bought with straw purchases, and they're being used by violent offenders. They're being stolen from law-abiding citizens because of a number of issues in poor gun handling and management, and then used by criminals to commit crimes, to commit robberies and shootings. So we're not seeing that more guns by law-abiding citizens actually makes us safer.
Just have a short time left. Chief Henninger, you have personally lived this. And what is your thought in terms of the proliferation of guns and whether it's made it a safer nation or not?
Well, my first thought is that there are many gun laws, and many of them are seen as a low priority for prosecution. So when an officer takes someone into custody for a gun violation, a felon with a gun, they're just not seeing much consequences for that behavior. And I think that's an area that we really need to refocus on, that there should be significant consequences for that first use of a firearm to commit any type of crime.
Chief Navales, Officer French lost her life to a straw purchase gun. We know that now. We're trying to make a better law, and I want to thank Senator Cornyn for his leadership on that with the bill that we supported. Can you comment on the types of guns that are being used to not only harm the police, but obviously used in crime in the city of Chicago?
Well, what I can say is that what we're seeing is an increase in firepower. The caliber of weapon that offenders are using out in the street is much greater. We are recovering more and more drum magazines. So we're not faced with, a 10-round magazine. We're faced with drum magazines that when you're standing in the center of an intersection in Chicago, let's say Pulaski and Jackson, and you are standing in a sea of 30, 40, even more shell casings, you know that the increase in the firepower and the capacity is growing. We're seeing more assault-style weapons being used, and it's incredibly scary for our officers to know that they have to go out there and be outmanned and outgunned.
Thank you, Chief. Senator Grassley.
Officer Anderson, thank you for your moving statement to us. You were present, as you told us, at this murder. You testified at the trial. Speak to the motivation of the murder and what you heard about it at the trial.
The individual at the trial showed little to no remorse. If anything, his facial expressions were incredibly disrespectful, smirking or almost smiling when hearing some of the things that were said or done. He had a clear, known disdain for law enforcement in the community, very well known. And on that day of that incident, he baited an officer into a pursuit purposefully to draw that officer out of town to attack that officer. He had a crazy idea that he was going to teach that officer a lesson that day, and some of his statements supported that.
Okay. Sheriff Bouchard, you spoke about supporting the legislation that I talked about. In your extensive experience running one of the country's largest sheriff offices, have you seen a substantial increase in the rate of dangerous but non-lethal interaction between your officers and criminal suspects? And what can we do to improve our ability to identify and measure these situations?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question, Senator. We have seen an increase, as I mentioned. We've seen a dramatic increase both on assaults but also on resisting arrest, which I think comes from the overall disrespect for authority and each other in general. Last night, we had 4 people resist arrest. Last night. It's not unusual for people to argue, to resist arrest, lawful orders, lawful commands, and that's why I think it's super important we collect the data per your proposed legislation so it can better inform the public and our training, but also that we, again, speak with that voice that this place to fight criminal charges or the police is in a courtroom. Everyone seems to think it's okay these days to argue or fight on the street, and there is no good outcome that comes from that.
Sergeant Penny, you spoke about the online radicalization of individuals who target the police and organized targeting of police officers. What is the relationship between the Defund the Police movement and the targeted violence against law enforcement?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for the question. Yeah, you can have something as benign as defund the police, like it was, just the logo. But once you take that on social media, the message proliferates with the hashtag, and I think that's what we've lost so much in discussion because we think of it as just being benign, but the reality is radical groups, individuals use this same content to incite violence against police. So let's think about it. In Minneapolis alone, it was trending with defund the police, right? Not that the city of Minneapolis wanted to burn down their own city, but I mean, even though they did defund it by $8 million, but the bottom line is it was that message of defund the police was trending on social media, and radical groups, individuals attached to it. And once that hashtag, once that image begins, being transferred along or proliferating through social media, more people are going to attach to it, and that's how you saw some of the riots happen over and over again. We need to have better regulation of these social media platforms. We need to have better control over the content that's being used to incite violence against police. Yeah, it may not necessarily be the benign image itself, but when that image is attached to hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag defund the police, hashtag kill the police, that's the thing that you have to worry about is what's proliferating with the message. And that's how those groups organize, Senator. Thank you.
Sergeant Penny, in your written testimony, you acknowledge that some good people only wanted to peacefully protest police brutality. Yet the research shows that police officers rarely use excessive force. For example, only about 1% of police shootings are unjustified, and yet it's sometimes used as an excuse to justify attack on police. Do you think that it's reasonable for critics to say that police brutality is the cause of attacks on police?
Absolutely not. First of all, I mean, we're talking about more nuanced type issues, Look, we have to qualify what police brutality is, because if you think about it, an officer can be accused of use of force violations. I mean, and it happens all the time. But a lot of times when they're adjudicated in court, they come out that they did follow the NIJ use of force continuum, and these officers are acquitted and the case goes away. So I think we do need to qualify what we're talking about in terms of this police brutality thing. But no, the bottom line is we cannot, under any circumstance, allow attacks on our police officers. Regardless of what these individuals say they're protesting police officers for, we're not going to give validation for it. In fact, I think we need to start holding individuals accountable, which we have not done a great job of prosecuting radical groups and people that incite violence against police officers using what we have on the books already, domestic terrorism policy. 18 U.S.C. 2331, Section 5, domestic terrorism essentially lays it out. The DOJ tells us that individuals that use force and intimidation for the purposes of changing governmental policy or acting in line with domestic terrorism. Okay, so why don't we have penalties for those individuals that do that? Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Grassley. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. I strongly believe that assault weapons have no place on our streets at all. And I think we should all at least be able to agree that teenagers who cannot even buy a beer should not be able to buy assault weapons. I've introduced a bill called the Age 21 Act, which would prohibit the sale of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines to anyone under the age of 21. Under current law, people who are under the age of 21 are not allowed to purchase handguns, but they are allowed to purchase assault weapons. And this disparity simply doesn't make sense, and it certainly costs lives. Chief, what particular risks do law enforcement officers face when young people are allowed easy access to assault weapons and high-capacity magazines? We have more than one chief.
We do.
All chiefs. Please.
Thank you very much. You know, when I think of young folk, I think of folks who are still going through mental development, and we want to make sure that people have that opportunity to exercise the right. But when you think of a young person who can't appreciate the consequences of an emotional act, I am personally, and I speak on my behalf, concerned to see young folks having that ability to carry those types of firearms. And I worry about our officers. The last thing that our officers want is to have an encounter which leads to a catastrophic end where some young person loses their life. It's very difficult on them. Use of force is something that our officers take incredibly serious. And being put in that kind of situation is incredibly difficult. And those catastrophic ends are hard for even our officers to process.
Thank you. Chief, please.
Thank you for the question. I would agree with the chief. We're now talking about people who are not fully developed, not only physical, but mentally and emotional, and are just totally unaware of the long-standing consequences of that decision. Number one, that is a weapon of war, and it's also a weapon designed to create great carnage and damage. It's not just a weapon for one to defend oneself. And they're making that decision to create carnage and damage, not realizing the long-lasting effect that it has on the families of the persons that they hit and kill, but how much damage it actually does, and then how much they will deal with that in their own lives after pulling that trigger. Ma'am, I say this all the time. The decision to pull the trigger is not made when the trigger is pulled. The decision to pull a trigger is actually made when a person puts their hand on a firearm and walks out of the door. They have then predisposed themselves to use that weapon should they need to, or have it used against them. So it really is a way of thinking that we have to change, not just with young people, but with all people, but with young people specifically. They're just not aware and don't have enough life experience to understand how difficult it will be for them and what they do to families of victims they kill and even victims who survive, how badly damaged those people are because of the volatility of those types of weapons.
Right. Anybody else have a comment?
Senator Feinstein, I agree with my peers. I think when the assault weapons ban was in place in the past, we had a 66% reduction in the use during that 10-year period. And so it makes perfect sense to go back to where we were at. And the IACP has always supported that.
Well, just a comment. I authored the assault weapons ban before, and I'm at it again. So I would appreciate any support from law enforcement that is possible. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Feinstein. Senator Tillis, I think they've notified us, is next on the Republican side.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. I also want to thank Senator Cornyn for the work that we did together with Sinema and Murphy to really address some of the mental health and other challenges that we have to make sure that we're keeping weapons out of hands of people that could harm themselves or other. Mr. Chairman, I came in to talk a little bit about legislation, but you said something in your opening comment that made me curious, and I take at face value. Every member of this committee, Democrat member, rejects the notion of defund the police. But I thought I'd just do a quick Google. You all can do it too. I just did it while I was here. I didn't have this printed until I looked up. I typed in Act Blue, all one word, and defund the police. And I got to this subpage in the aggregation engine for progressive candidates. What does it say? It's 31.12, Run for Justice. It's a direct contribution to Black Lives Matter. What's most fascinating about this is the first question that they answer under frequently asked questions. Why 3.12 miles? Because 3.12 translates into the alphabet for ACAB, which equals all cops are bastards. This is on the Act Blue website that they raised $250,000 on. The same website raised $513 million between April the 1st and June 30th of this year. This radical concept of defunding the police has gone from the radical left, a minority of the party, to something that the primary fundraising engine for liberal progressives is now touting. This is a cancer, and we have to understand that we do have to do work. It's why I took the political step to work on the community safety bill. We have to take steps on that side, but for us to be dismissive about this not being a problem, I ask you, or anybody else here in law enforcement, do you consider your colleagues bastards? They didn't say some of them. They didn't say most of them. They said all of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so we have to recognize this is a cancer. This has to stop. Somebody that knows Act Blue needs to know this is not helpful. And for the Democrats who genuinely believe that this is not a good strategy, they have to stand up and stand against this. I didn't plan that speech, so I'm sorry it came out that way, but this makes me mad when we say one thing and we see another thing. All cops are bastards? Are you kidding me? Can you imagine what a young, impressionable person that lands on that website that may be on the bubble right now, what that could do? That could inspire them to do some of the very things that you all have talked about. Taunt a police officer, get them out there and try and kill them. That's happening. Black Lives Matter, by the way, if you punch out of this website, it goes directly to a Black Lives Matter, and I just saw this when I was Googling this morning during this hearing. It's time for a change. And then they go in talking about how to defund the police. It is time for a change, and it's time to stop this crap. This is killing people. This is endangering police officers, and it's making the very communities that they suggest are at most at risk less safe. So with that, I want to talk about a few pieces of legislation. Number one, I'm a co-sponsor of Senator Grassley's bill. I hope we can get more data. Number two, I wish the Fraternal Order of Police were here because this is one of their top priorities and they have data. We should make data-driven decisions the same way that Senator Cornyn and I made data-driven decisions on the community safety bill. I think we should look at the Protect and Serve Act. It's a bill that I've filed that makes it a federal crime to assault or murder a police officer. Up the ante. They will know, and they will react, and law enforcement officers will be saved. I also think we should take a look at Back the Blue and Thin Blue Line and Defending Our Defenders Act. All bills that this committee could take up and move forward. All bills that will make progress. And I'm here to do everything I can to be driven by data, to take a look at community safety issues where we see too many guns in the hands of people who want to do harm. But we have to understand this is foundational. When I can go and get my friends and family to donate to the All Cops Are Bastards run, and they also encourage running around police stations, playing music. This needs to be a primary focus of anything we do that comes out of this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Tillerson. Since you referred to my opening statement, I want to make a comment first. Thank you.
And Mr. Chair, if I may, I'd like to submit this for the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
I want to make a comment first. Thank you. I thanked Senator Cornyn earlier. I want to thank you as well for the bipartisan gun safety bill. I should have acknowledged you, and I'm sorry I did not. I know you played a key role in establishing that. Second, I have never been called to a meeting of Act Blue. I've never been asked to approve their agenda or their website. It is true that they raise money in the name of progressives and liberals, but I have nothing to do with their agenda whatsoever. I shouldn't be held any more responsible for what Act Blue does than ask our Republican members to be held responsible for the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers or any other group that might associate themselves with conservatives. People should be judged on how they actually vote and what they believe. And that's all I ask personally, and that's what I'm going to offer to the members of the committee.
Well, Mr. Chairman, just because I don't begrudge Act Blue. They give to candidates and I know they've given to several members of the Senate who are friends of mine. I don't begrudge them for advancing a progressive worldview. But when they also use the same engine to have people log on, this is how this works. You log on to support the All Cops Are Bastards run, and then Act Blue knows that when they have future candidates who are also willing to sign on to that, they'll do a separate email saying, support candidate A because they work to defund the police. That's the way this process works, and that's why it's a cancer that's got to be taken out.
You know, we could get into a conversation about January 6th, and I won't, but I want to hold members accountable.
And every single one of them should be in jail.
Thank you. I want to hold members accountable for how they vote and what they believe, but to attribute other organizations to us is unfair. The next up is Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Durbin. Thank you, Ranking Member Grassley. Thank you for holding this valuable and this critical hearing. And I want to thank each of our witnesses today who have not just testified, but who have demonstrated through your lifetime of service and through the actions you've taken what Commissioner Harrison said in his opening, that policing is a calling, and that having the courage and determination to stand up and serve and to continue serving. Officer Anderson, Chief Navales, after witnessing or being directly harmed in the line of duty, after having the opportunity to understand just how challenging this calling is, I just wanted to open by expressing my gratitude to each one of you individually and to the men and women you represent with whom you serve, and to the families and fellow officers who are here. I know that it is more difficult than I can comprehend to come and to testify about what was a horrific, life-altering day in Cedar Falls in the line of duty, to see Patrol Sergeant Smith killed and to have to then talk with his widow and his family, to have been wounded yourself, Chief Navales, and then to have with us Ella's mother, Elizabeth, and to continue serving and leading an agency that looks to you for leadership in a difficult and dangerous time. I had the honor to serve as the county executive in Newcastle County, Delaware. We had 380 sworn officers during most of my time there. And I will never forget one of the hardest days of my life in this body was when Joe Zerba, someone known personally to me, an 18-year veteran of our force, a talented and warm and literally one of the best, was killed in the line of duty, responding to a disorderly subject in Penn Acres, and doing what Lieutenant Zerba, he was a sergeant but was promoted posthumously, what he always did was to lean in, take matters into his own hands, help solve and track down, and he was stabbed in the neck and killed by someone who's now serving life. But I will never forget that funeral and his widow, Kathy, and what she said. She, at the very end, there were 5,000 people there, law enforcement from all over our nation and thousands of Delawareans. And she looked every one of us in the eye and said, "Do not cry for me." Other women, other people will have decades of marriage to an ordinary person. I had a few brief years with an exceptional man, with a hero. And you couldn't hear a pin drop in that room. And our community, Salesianum School, where Lieutenant Zerba attended, the Newcastle County Police Department, and so many others have every year renewed his memory and continued to invest in the training and the support and the needs of the men and women of law enforcement in Delaware. I could continue. I went to the funeral for Patrolman Chad Spicer and have had the blessing of knowing his mother and his daughter. Corporal Stephen Ballard, whose widow Louise Cummings continues to lead law enforcement efforts in Delaware to respect our state police. Her husband was an exceptional patrolman, killed in the line of duty. Corporal Keith Hecook from Delmar, whose funeral last year, was a simply riveting moment. You have brought to this hearing today the sort of quiet dignity and determination that is so important as we try to come together to address this issue as a nation. I will tell you that whether it's working together to try and keep dangerous weapons out of the hands of those who would do harm to law enforcement, making sure that we've got bulletproof vests for agencies, large and small, that are appropriately fitting, state-of-the-art, something I've worked hard in over 12 years with Senator Leahy to make sure we sustained the Bulletproof Vest Partnership, or investing in mental health, in resources, in training and support to make sure that officers have the resources they need to continue to serve or to go on and lead productive lives. There's a solemn obligation on us not to turn this into a show, but to be serious and deliberate about the work that we do with you. I am a Delawarean. I succeeded on this committee and in the Senate, our president, and I know him personally, and I know that he doesn't just say, thank you for your service. He doesn't just say that he supports law enforcement. To the debate back and forth about defunding the police, he has put into action in his budgets and with his priorities, making America safer. The American Rescue Plan delivered over $10 billion for state and local hiring for law enforcement, and the Safer America Plan just announced highlights that in his FY23 budget, there's $37 billion for law enforcement that includes the funding to hire 100,000 more officers. The agency I was fortunate to have some responsibility for benefited directly from COPS grants many years ago. I hope we will, on a bipartisan basis, provide these resources to you. I know I'm running short on time, so let me ask two questions, if I could, of Chief Henninger in particular, if I might. I work closely with IACP, provided critical advice, PERF and IACP, in leadership and management decisions I had to make as county executive. I'm grateful for the IACP. I'm leading, along with Ranking Member Grassley, a bill that would direct the DOJ to propose programs to better address PTSD in law enforcement. Senator Blunt and I co-lead the Law Enforcement Caucus here in the Senate. And we had an event about this to try and better understand PTSD resources. My impression is that unlike the military, which is also working to address critical issues in terms of soldier suicide, which has a unitary chain of command, we have 18,000 agencies. We have disaggregated resources at the federal, state, and local level. How can we best address the lack of resources, training, and support? Are there models for mental health in law enforcement that you would urge us to invest in?
Thank you, Senator. The question is very broad, and I think there's a lot that needs to be done to solve the mental health-related crisis issues around policing. It goes to the way that officers are treated on a regular basis in the street, and we feel like the fact that we've pulled in the military and we've pulled in the experts to try to identify the best practices is really moving forward with that. But the mental health check-ins for our officers on a regular basis is really important, and funding that is a difficult thing, as you would know, from a local level. That's a very expensive proposition. So we feel that those are very important things to the wellness of our officers. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, could I pose for one last question of the major sheriffs, or should I?
If you could. Members haven't voted yet.
I apologize. I would love to follow up with you, Sheriff Bouchard, if I might, but I will yield. We have a lot of work to do together, and I appreciate the Major County Sheriffs Association and your support for driving for opportunity, and I look forward to following up with you. Thank you again to our witnesses today.
Thanks, Senator Coons. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sergeant Penny, you talked about some of the anti-police rhetoric, the lack of respect for our men and women in blue, the role of some of the progressive, so-called progressive district attorneys that don't prosecute crimes. Some people are saying, well, we ought to eliminate legal protections, for example, like qualified immunity that protects police officers from civil lawsuits unless they do cross that line that they should not cross. But I'd like to suggest that this sort of attitude starts at the top. You may recall back in 2000, shortly after President Biden was elected president, he nominated Kristen Clark to be Associate Attorney General of the United States, headed the Department of Justice, the significant portion of the Department of Justice, who wrote an article in 2020 entitled, "I Prosecuted Police Killings, Defund the Police, but Be Strategic." Also, President Biden nominated, and the Senate confirmed without my vote, Vanita Gupta, who at various times in her previous capacity advocated not only defunding the police. Now, she said that was for the organization she represented and not her personal view. She also advocated for eliminating qualified immunity and for decriminalizing drugs. The Washington Post fact-checked Vanita Gupta's testimony at her confirmation hearing and gave her they concluded, for this tango of previously unacknowledged flip-flops, Gupta earns an upside-down Pinocchio. So do you believe, Sergeant Penny, it's important for the leadership of the law enforcement community to send a clear message of support for law enforcement as opposed to blaming them first?
Absolutely, Senator. First of all, let me say, in response to the leaders, especially our leaders of Congress and our president as well, who has promoted this idea of defunding the police. Sometimes you have individuals, the king in the high castle, sometimes forget how things really work in the real world because they're so disconnected from the people. And unfortunately, this type of messaging is the type of messaging that allows individuals that are actually out there to become vulnerable to certain attacks. So I will say this, Senator. The bottom line is we cannot allow our police officers to not be protected. We cannot allow certain messages to be put into American society that's going to allow us to be attacked just because of the job that we do. And unfortunately, so many people out here have convoluted these arguments about what it means to protect police with gun rights and all this other stuff that has nothing to do. We're talking about human behavior, individuals that are going out to attack police officers simply because of the job that they do, simply because of the uniform that they wear. Enough is enough. We got to stop linking all these things together and start doing the right thing to protect the interests of our American government. We've given up too much, Senator. And I will add that the cities that did defund the police, we saw $150 million from Austin, Texas, right? Right there in Texas. What is Austin going through right now? An increased level of violence. We saw that same thing in Baltimore, $22 million taken from the police. We saw an increased level of violence. We saw that in Philadelphia, $33 million taken from the police. What do we see? An increased level of violence. Guys, this doesn't work, and we need to do it. We need to fix it right here in this committee. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Sergeant. Sheriff Bouchard, good to see you again. Thank you for being here. I want to talk a little bit about the nexus between drugs, guns, and violence in our communities. Last year alone, 108,000 Americans died of drug overdoses. Almost all of those drugs come across the border in my state, in Texas, from Mexico or other countries south, or even the precursors, as you know, from China, which are used to make synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Would you agree with me that the distribution network, whether it's in Minnesota or any state we could identify here, is primarily through criminal street gangs who then protect their market share and their territory using guns and committing other crimes of violence? Would you make that connection between the border, drugs, and violence in our local communities?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, and on so many levels, we agree with that statement. The Major County Sheriffs of America is very firm in belief we need to secure our borders. We believe the immigration system needs to be fixed to help people that want to come here for the right reasons and want to come here for a better life, but we need to have a process to make sure that that border is secure to prevent what's happening there. The flood of drugs across the border. I run one of the largest narcotics enforcement team consortiums in our state, and we're seeing a tremendous amount of fentanyl. Last night, we saved 3 people from drug overdoses. My deputies have deployed Narcan. I was the first in the state to save lives with that. And as you said, oftentimes we see drug dealers that are willing and actively prepared to use violence to protect their turf. I received a text on the way into this hearing that my narcotics enforcement teams asked for SWAT potential support on a raid today because the suspect is a career felon that is known to carry firearms and is willing to use them.
Senator Whitehouse.
Thanks, Chairman Durbin, and thank you to you and to Ranking Member Grassley for holding this hearing. Just in my time, Stephen Shaw, Jimmy Allen, and Cornell Young were all shot to death serving in the Providence Police Department, one police department. And as Chief Navales described very eloquently, the traumatic effect of that throughout the department was very real. So it's very good that we are having this hearing to focus on these cases. For what it's worth, the man who murdered Stephen Shaw was killed at the scene by Stephen's fellow officers. The man who murdered Jimmy Allen is serving life in prison. And the death of Cornell Young was a tragic blue-on-blue incident that was also extremely painful for the Providence Police Department. I'm very proud of the Providence Police Department, I will say, and I just wanted to express this history that they have while we're on the subject here in the room. There are so many of you that I'm going to ask 3 questions and ask if you might do me the courtesy of answering them in writing. It's called a question for the record here. If you don't care to, you don't need to, but if you do, I'd really appreciate it. Senator Cornyn and I have been working on a bill to improve crisis intervention resources for police departments. It's called the De-Escalation Training Act. I would be very grateful if you or your organizations would take a look at that and give any advice that you might have. Senator Hawley and I, some time ago, did the STOIC Act, which provides additional mental health resources for police officers, for police departments to deploy. But even in the brief time since then, we've learned a lot more, and I'd be interested in any thoughts on how that act might be updated. It passed into law with very, very broad bipartisan support, so I'm sure amendments could pass quite quickly if you'd be interested in providing some ideas about that. And the last thing I'd be interested in hearing from you about is high-velocity ammunition. We talk a lot about assault rifles, but the speed of the projectile itself is another separate factor. And as I understand it, it's a factor in the ability of your body armor to withstand the bullet, and it's a factor in the physical destruction wrought by the projectile in the human body when it hits it. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on what harm there is from high-velocity ammunition to people in your profession, and any thoughts you have about trying to restrict that particular type of ammunition. And I'll close because it's, I think, impossible not to talk about the dangers to police officers and injuries and fatalities, certainly as a member of Congress, without referencing the heroism and simple, plain, hard, tough work that our Capitol Police did on January 6th, fending off the mob that President Trump sent up here to do damage to the building, and obviously they did a lot of damage to police officers. I think the January 6th Commission, the Bipartisan January 6th Commission, has done a very fair job of presenting what that day looked like to the police officers who were here, and for those who were injured that day, and for those who, for whom fatality resulted from that day. It's worth, I think, just expressing a moment's honor and appreciation to them for their service on that bloody day. And with that, I guess I'm the senior person here, so I'll now turn to Senator Lee, followed by Senator Klobuchar, followed by Senator Cotton, it seems, unless the order should change.
Thank you, and thanks to each of you for your service and for being here today to talk to us. I'll never forget some of the emotions I experienced in 2020 when watching one weekend in June of that year as violent protests erupted in Salt Lake City, as they had in so many other cities at that time. I had never seen anything quite like this, not in my home state, not in Salt Lake City. I watched as a mob of violent protesters took a police car, turned it all the way upside down, and then, as I recall, lit the thing on fire. There were dozens of officers injured in those violent riots and protests that weekend. It was concerning. It felt as though it was foreboding something bad, in addition to being an awful thing in and of itself. And the facts as they've played out since then have shown that feeling to be accurate. 2 years later, and our country is in the midst of a really ugly crime spike. Homicide rates in Utah are up 44% compared to just a few years ago in 2019, along with assaults and property crimes and all sorts of other offenses. Attacks on police officers are at their highest level that we've seen since 1995. In 2021, there were 73 officers nationwide who were killed in the line of duty, and nearly 1/3 of those, 25 officers, were killed in unprovoked attacks. Now, to give that ugly statistic a terrifying context, only 2 unprovoked attacks against police officers were recorded in 2020. In Utah, more police officers were shot at in 2021 than in any other recorded year, resulting in injury to 8 police officers. In one of those cases, 2 officers were injured when they went simply to check on a man who was lying in the grass near the sheriff's office in Salt Lake City. And as they were doing that, the man opened fire on them. In March of this year, a man ran up behind a police officer as he was on patrol at the Salt Lake City International Airport and sucker punched him. And just last week, a 4-year-old boy shot at police officers from inside a vehicle in Salt Lake City, claiming that he had been encouraged to do precisely that by his father. This is troubling. Mr. Anderson, can you tell us what impact some of the anti-police rhetoric may have had over the last few years, and what impact that rhetoric and these alarming statistics might have in your experience when it comes to officer safety and officer morale?
I think in the incident I was involved in, it had a direct impact. Like I said before, the individual clearly did not like law enforcement. Clearly that day he was trying to accomplish killing an officer. We had so much information, and I won't get into all that as far as things that led up to that we didn't know, that we later found out. And when you go through these types of incidences, it just hits everybody very hard. And I don't know how you would prevent that necessarily, but I know that's why we're here.
Sergeant Penny, do you think anti-police rhetoric and violence trickles down into the community? And what impact do you think this has on members of communities throughout our country?
I'm sorry, Senator. It has a major impact on communities across this country, especially our communities of color. I'm active in the black community around the country, not just locally in Texas, but I travel the country and try to engage with the black community because I want to build a relationship between the police and the community. And what many of these people have told me was that they never agreed to a defund the police initiative. What happened was you had these politicians that got online and put out their messages about defunding the police, and it just proliferated through social media. But the reality is those communities with people of color were being victimized at a higher rate than anywhere else in this country. And the bottom line is we haven't found any way to hold the individuals accountable that have proliferated this message, that have allowed our police to be attacked. We just have to find a way, Senator, to where we can hold individuals accountable for using rhetoric, and a lot of leadership here in Congress, a lot of leadership here. We have to find a way to hold these people accountable for encouraging the type of acts that's happening right now in our society. Thank you.
So the violence that occurs as a result of anti-police rhetoric very often isn't focused in the gated communities of the wealthy and the well-connected.
Absolutely not. No, it's the communities that are already having problems. I mean, this is what do you think the criminals come from? The criminals are right there alongside the people that they're living with, all the ghettos, the projects in the inner city. What do you think these criminals get out? They get out of prison and go right back into those communities. Who do you think they're victimizing? A lot of these people can't pack up and just leave the community. That's the catch-22 with these arguments. We talk about why don't they just leave? Well, a lot of people can't leave. Half of my family is still in the inner city right now. They can't leave. They don't have the resources to up and go. But they're still being victimized by the criminals that are living beside them, that are living in these communities. So I will say there has to be accountability for rhetoric that's used to incite violence against our police across the country.
Thank you, Sergeant Penny. I see my time has expired.
Yeah, thank you, Senator Lee. Thank you so much for being here. And I was prosecutor for 8 years, ran the biggest office in our state, and I also now chair the Senate Rules Committee, so I've made it my mission to focus on rebuilding our Capitol Police. We're pleased that we have new police chief, that we are still recruiting officers. We're still down, but we've seen improvements in morale, and I've literally, after what happened on January 6th, that we lost officers, from both that day and from suicide, I have made it my mission to make this place better for them. So many of them injured, so many of them really never going to be the same. And that has been my focus since I've gotten here. I also I wanted to just clarify a few things. I just heard about defund the police. I'll give you an example of my city of Minneapolis. There was a ballot initiative that was described that way. I opposed it, so did the governor, and it actually was defeated in a liberal city. I think one of the focuses has got to be, as you all know, reforming some of the practices, but at the same time, funding the police. And I guess that's my first question of you, Chief Henninger. You called for an expansion of the COPS program in your opening remarks. I actually lead that bipartisan legislation with Senator Murkowski, as well as Senator Coons, Tillis, Feinstein, and Graham to reauthorize the COPS hiring program. How have you seen the COPS hiring program help local law enforcement to improve training, upgrade technology, and retain experienced officers?
So over the last 30 years, the COPS program has been wonderful to give all size organizations the opportunity to improve their ability to support their communities. From bringing on additional officers to show the elected leaders that there was a need, or from a technology project to get it off the ground and started, it's worked really well to help make us a better profession and professionalize and understand how to be better interacting with the community. So it's been very supportive, and we're really appreciative of the work you're doing to bring that back.
Okay. Oh, Sheriff, you wanted to add something?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Senator, for your support of so many of those kinds of things. I just want to mention on the COPS program, one of the challenges that a lot of the communities have is the match. So our brothers and sisters in fire service, most of their grants, their personnel grants, don't have a match. But when you have, especially an urban community or a community that's struggling with their budgets, they may want the position, but the match becomes a prohibitor. So anything that could be done on that front would be certainly helpful. I know one of my communities that we police under contract is constantly budget struggle. And so the match impediment that exists in law enforcement, especially for personnel and cops, would be something that would be
I know, I
appreciated.
just encountered this with one of our mayors and worked with the Justice Department on it. We found a way, but I would like to improve that. So thanks for bringing that up. I appreciate that. Commissioner Harrison, you testified that the availability of illegal guns is a direct factor in the spike in gun violence. I agree. Yesterday, I introduced a bill with Senator Peters of Michigan and 9 other colleagues to require federal and state law enforcement to crack down on devices that can turn semi-automatic guns into fully automatic weapons. These devices, as you probably know, can be purchased from foreign manufacturers, as we talk about the internet, for under $20 and can be installed in under a minute. Can you talk about the challenge law enforcement faces when responding to gun violence incidents that involve weapons that can fire automatically, and what you think of this proposal?
Well, I think that's a great proposal. We've seen an increase in weapons that can be fired automatically, not just from people who can buy the devices and put them in the weapon, but can actually make them off laser printers fairly quickly and put them into assault rifles and into handguns. And so we have seen an increase in polymer 80s or ghost guns or privately made firearms. We're seeing more of an increase in that than we're seeing in your traditional firearms in the city of Baltimore. And I think that's a trend that we're seeing around the country as well. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to stop the number of shootings, because with those fully automatic weapons, perpetrators are shooting and striking multiple victims, as you heard in the opening statement. While they may only intend to shoot one person, they're shooting multiple people. And so we have had an increase in the number of shootings where we had 3 or 4 or 5 people shot when only one person was the intended target, simply because the weapon most likely was an automatic weapon rather than a semi-automatic weapon. So it's not just for my city, but I think all of us are seeing increasing challenges with that specific issue. So we need to find a way to be able to eliminate the purchase of those devices and the creation of those devices, and have strict penalties and consequences for those who are caught with it.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I appreciate that. And I think part of this is not just responding to things from the past, but looking to what's right in front of us.
Absolutely.
Which is things like this, which you guys have to do every day in your jobs. I just want to, and Chief Henninger, I'm sorry about the loss of your partner to gun violence. It's actually what's motivated me for doing a lot of things that I've worked on, including the closing the boyfriend loophole that we recently did in the bipartisan agreement that Senator Cornyn and Senator Murphy and Tillis and Sinema and many others put together. The case I most remember of an officer being killed was a guy in Lake City who responded to a domestic violence case, young woman who called in, a boyfriend completely having mental health issues, a veteran actually, and the officer came to the door and he had his own bulletproof vest. You talked about protection, but the guy shot him in the head. And I went to that funeral, and at that funeral was in the church, that dad who was killed, the cop, had been there just a few weeks before for the nativity play with his 2 little boys that were in it. And there was a little baby as well. And that mom walked down the aisle, that same church where her husband had been sitting in the front row watching the nativity play with a little girl with a blue dress with stars on it and with those 2 little boys by her side. And we got to remember that this violence, so many times it's officers who are on the front end of it, and that gets forgotten. And that was part of my motivation in working on the boyfriend loophole, only because I think officers know some of the most dangerous scenes you get called to can be this domestic violence scene. So I just want to thank you for your service. I continue being from the state where the tragic murder of George Floyd occurred. Devoted to reform, but at the same time believing that we can invest in our law enforcement and get that respect that you deserve, and move forward together. So I just want to thank you for what you're doing. And I think I was going to turn over to Senator Cotton, but someone just passed me a note. It was Senator Blackburn. Is that right? Okay, so it wasn't a choice. It was the order. Senator Blackburn, thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to each of you for being here today. We are so grateful for your taking the time and being here to talk with us. I know Senator Tillis talked some on the respect issue, and Senator Klobuchar just brought up the issue of respect. And I think that when you look at some of these issues between communities and police, that's of concern. But then the dramatic decline in trust between police and the district attorneys who choose not to prosecute some of these crimes, cases of illegal possession of firearms, domestic violence, resisting arrest, theft. And they have a tendency to promote these bail reform measures. And Chief Navales, if I could come to you on this, I know Chicago has had as many as 100 alleged murderers released on mere home monitoring. That is shocking to me. And also in Chicago, I was looking at some of your stats. Police made arrests in only 12% of the criminal incidences in 2021, which is the lowest rate since 2001. And that was when the data was first released. The FOP has written your DA, Kim Foxx, noting a deep mistrust between Chicago police officers and the DA's office, also stating, and I'm quoting, "We no longer believe that your office will treat our members fairly, either in the arrests they make or when they are victims of crime." So, you're a 21-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what are you doing, and why are you not loudly calling for a change in prosecutors who are pushing this decriminalization, decarceration, depolicing efforts and rhetoric?
Well, ma'am, respectfully, we do the best that we can. We work with our Cook County State's attorneys to put the best cases forward and to achieve the desired result.
All right, and voluntary resignations, that has been an issue with your department. I know it's an issue with large police departments around the country. They have increased by nearly 300%. And we've recently seen the entire police force resign in towns in Colorado, North Carolina, Georgia, Missouri. Fewer police officers mean increased risk for the remaining officers. So what are you and your leadership doing to turn the tide on this tumultuous state that you're seeing in police departments?
Well, one of the things we've done in the Chicago Police Department is we put up a recruitment team, something that we didn't have before, right? We understand that the environment...
What kind of results is that seeing?
So we have seen an increase in the number of officers applying for our positions. For example, we have 400 currently new recruits in the academy.
Let me move on. Mr. Penny, I see you shaking your head, and I know you want to respond to that. So quickly, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Senator. The unfortunate reality is that this whole defund the police, the legitimacy of our officers has led to officers not even wanting to go into the profession. And the bottom line is you have a lot of these DAs that are that are releasing these criminals back onto the streets, the officers they've already said they're tired of doing this double work over and over again. And let's put this in context. We want to talk about the real beast in the room. We're talking about an 85% recidivism rate of violent felons that come out of prison. They come out, and within 5 years, they're going right back for similar crimes. So we have to figure out how to close this loophole to stop our...
Okay, so let me interrupt
Absolutely.
you right there. Closing that loophole, goes to that issue of respect and the tearing down of respect and the ability of law enforcement to do their job, correct?
Absolutely, it does.
Okay. Mr. Harrison, I want to come to you. Issue of qualified... let's see, Sheriff, I want to come to you on the issue of qualified immunity, Sheriff Bouchard. Talk to me about this and what are the effects, positive and negative, from this push to strip qualified immunity from our law enforcement officers?
Thank you, Senator. The effect is terrible on the morale. They're already feeling very much unsupported on so many levels. And when you talk about qualified immunity, people will say, well, they shouldn't have immunity from being held accountable. And I answer, I agree. They don't have immunity. They have qualified immunity, meaning if they followed the Constitution, the laws of the state, the policies and procedure of our agency, and it's within clearly established practices, principles, and rights, then they get immunity. So if we have an incident, let's say, where a deputy is pursuing a suspect and he falls through a plate glass window, oftentimes you'll see around the country, they sue the officer for that injury even though they were committing a crime and fleeing from the police. Qualified immunity gets to court and says, no, this wasn't the officer's fault. The officer was doing their job, case is dismissed. Without that, a lot of our officers and deputies are saying, why would I do this job? I'm willing to risk my life, but I'm not willing to risk my family's home and future, even when I do the job according to policy, procedure, law, and the Constitution.
Thank you for the explanation.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. And my thanks to all of you professionals who've dedicated your life to law enforcement, each of you. I was a federal prosecutor for 4.5 years as the U.S. Attorney in Connecticut, and then served as our state's Attorney General for 20 years. So I've come to admire the men and women who do your job on the front lines in law enforcement. Last thing in the world we want to do is delegitimize our police or defund them. In fact, I've advocated that we give them more resources for the needs that they have in doing their jobs and focus their responsibilities so they can do what they do best, which is protect us from the risks and dangers of criminals. And we need to protect our police from the threats to them that come from firearms. In fact, firearms that in many respects may make criminals in possession of stronger firepower than our police do. One of the areas that's particularly concerned me are ghost guns. I'm very proud of the Bipartisan Safe Communities Act that I and others here helped to lead in the Senate that we recently passed. It's a modest step, but it opens the door to do more in terms of gun violence prevention. I'm hoping that we can do more on assault weapons and safe storage and high-capacity magazines and on ghost guns. As you know, these are firearms that under current law are not required to be serialized. They're not required to be sold by sellers who are licensed. They're not required to be sold with background checks. And so they are very difficult to trace at crime scenes. And all it takes is a few $100s and a do-it-yourself gun-making kit, often on the kitchen tables, to make them. So in Connecticut, this is one of the major emerging threats to our police, ghost guns. we're finding more and more of them, and increasing numbers are being used in crimes. Commissioner Harrison, you testified before the Subcommittee on the Constitution, which I chair, about the threats that communities across the United States face because of ghost guns. You said, ghost guns, and I'm quoting, ghost guns add a new level of danger to the work that you do. And I know Chief Henninger, in your capacity in 2018 at the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a resolution was adopted strongly supporting measures dealing with the need to stop ghost guns. A general question to all of you. Is there anybody here who feels ghost guns are not a threat and don't need to be addressed? Would you all agree that ghost guns are an increasing threat on our streets and our communities? If anybody disagrees, please say so. The record should record that you are in agreement. And I would invite any of you who have comments on ghost guns now, please, to make them, beginning whatever order that you'd like to comment.
Thank you, Senator. Certainly in my jurisdiction, that is an increasing threat. We are seeing more and more privately made firearms, or termed ghost guns, being recovered from the streets of Baltimore by both perpetrators and victims. And we have seen quite an increase in numbers in juveniles in possession of these, as young as 13 years old. And that is increasingly troublesome, because not only can we not trace those firearms, but they're being purchased by minors or given to minors by someone who did purchase them and assemble them. And then those guns are being used against other citizens. And if we cannot trace them, then it makes it extremely hard when we find the perpetrator to put a quality case together, putting the gun in the hand of the perpetrator, unless there's DNA or some other type of evidence. But the gun itself becomes very problematic, not only for the person who pulled the trigger, but tracing it back to its origin and how it inevitably wound up into the hands of the killer, especially a minor child. We're seeing that more and more in Baltimore City.
Thank you.
I would just add that the fact that you can, in 45 minutes with a laser printer, make a trigger system that will make any handgun or rifle into an automatic weapon, that we would require you to get a federal firearms permit from the ATF to possess otherwise, is very, very concerning.
Thank you all for being here today. I think this point of agreement among everyone here is very significant, and I think should help shape our next efforts on protecting our police and enabling them to better protect ourselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Senator Blumenthal. Senator from Arkansas.
Gentlemen, thank you all for being here today, and thank you for your service to our nation, to our communities. You know, when you see troops walking through the airport, they always get thanked for their service. Sometimes people buy them a sandwich or a beer. I wish that all of you and all of the men and women in blue that you represent had the same treatment always. In some ways, I think you face greater dangers. You know, it sure is dangerous when we send troops into harm's way, as we have so many times over the last 20 years. But at least they get to come home. And when they get home, then they can hang up their armor and they put their rifles in the lockers and not have to worry about being killed the next day the way they had for the previous 365 days. But for law enforcement, you never get that break. Every night when you come home, you know you got to go out again the next day, and you know that that next day may be the day that you face off someone who is going to try to take your life. So I want to commend all of you, whatever your views on any of the issues we discuss or your politics, and all the men and women that you represent in blue all around the country for serving our nation and serving our communities to keep us all safe. I talk with law enforcement officers a lot when I'm around the state of Arkansas or when I'm traveling through airports and other places, and I talk to them a lot about recruiting and retention, which you've just touched on some this morning. I want to relay a particularly, to me, sad story about an officer in Chicago's O'Hare Airport who I talked to about a year ago. And police, like the the military, since I'm making the comparison, oftentimes is a family business. A lot of folks are multi-generational police in their families. And this officer, who was just a year or two away from retiring, said that he had a son who had been police for 5 years. And his son came to him one day, and he could tell that the son was a bit embarrassed, sheepish, didn't know how to start the conversation. He told me I didn't know what he wanted to discuss. I don't know, was he telling me that he was broke and needed money? Was he getting a divorce from his wife? What was it that was causing him to hold back in this conversation? And finally, his son told him, Dad, I'm going to turn in the badge. I can't do it anymore. I just can't be police like you have been for the next 25 years of my life. And this officer, who again had dedicated almost 30 years of his life to policing Chicago streets, and who had proudly watched as his son was sworn in 5 years earlier, said that he told his son, I don't blame you, son. If I was your age, I don't think I could do it either. I think that's a very sad commentary for the state of respect for law enforcement in our communities, that lifelong police whose son was police wouldn't recommend his son make it a career. So I just want to ask you, if an 18 to 25-year-old comes to you and says, should I be police? Should I dedicate my life to police the way all of you have? What would you tell them and why? Sheriff Bouchard, do you want to start?
Thank you, Senator. Well, you're spot on. Surveys a decade ago, and continuously for many years, used to say that the average officer was asked, would you suggest this as a career to friends, family, and your children? And it was universally super high, 80, 85%, and now it's reversed. So I don't disagree. I would tell the same thing. In fact, I told my kids, I love my country, I love my community, but I don't want any cops or military because it's such a challenge for them these days, and I end up with both because they said they follow me, not necessarily listen to me. So that's exactly the case, because it's such a challenge on so many levels to have your life on the line, but not be assured that you're going to have the support of around the country, and I'll speak generically for the major counties, to have the support of the prosecutor, to have the support of the community, to have support of the system. You know, as you go through so many things, what they experience, how they're treated afterwards, how they're supported afterwards with their mental health channels on all levels. And then compound it with the changing affairs of compensation. Many people used to get into police work, not for the great hours, because they're terrible, not for the great pay, because it's not, but they knew at the end of the day they'd have a pension and they'd have a retirement, and now that's gone. We don't have pensions and we don't have medical and retirement. So they began to analyze this as a younger person: no medical, no pensions, terrible hours, terrible pay, and the disrespect that they're seeing across the nation. Why should I do that? And it's hard for us to give an answer. You know, I love it. In fact, I recruited 3 people today. So far, I got all no's. Even the Uber driver told me no on the way here. But I believe in it. As it said, we believe this is a calling, not a job. But it's hard to translate that into when people are job searching, not calling searching.
Senator, I think it's an excellent question, and from my perspective, this is an opportunity for people who want to make a difference in their communities, and particularly people of color. This is where the narrative, the negative narrative, has been really problematic. If you're somebody who wants to make a difference in your community and the leaders in your community are saying the police are bad, it's really hard to overcome. And so, but we need people who want to do this work, because it is a calling and it is an opportunity to make a difference in your community, and every officer is a leader. Clearly, we have bad apples like every other profession, but this is an opportunity to make a difference in our communities, and we need those people to do that.
Unfortunately, my time has expired. I'd love to hear all 4 of the other witnesses' answers, but I want to defer to the chairman and other senators. But thank you all. Thank you, Senator.
Senator Cruz?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here today. Each of you put your lives on the line to keep us safe, and I view a very important part of my job as having your backs. It's tough right now to be a cop. I try to make a point with every police officer I see in Texas and across the country to thank every officer. The discussion Senator Cotton was just having, I hear that from young officers all the time, that the rhetoric, the demonization of police officers has a real consequence. We're in the grips of nothing short of a war on police. According to FBI data, 73 police officers were feloniously killed in 2021, a nearly 60% increase from 2020. And sadly, this trend has continued throughout 2022. As of June 30th, 178 officers were shot in the line of duty, 33 of whom were killed. But it's not just these shocking numbers, it's the way these shootings have come about. These aren't solely officers shot while intervening in a robbery or investigating a domestic disturbance, but more and more, we're seeing an increase in ambush-style attacks, where the shooting or killing of an officer is not incidental to some other crime, but rather it's the primary objective. It's the primary purpose of the crime. In 2021, there were 133 officers shot in 107 separate ambush-style attacks. And this increase in violence is fueled by dangerous and irresponsible rhetoric, including, sadly, by a number of members of Congress, who, whenever there is an officer-involved shooting, immediately move to demonize the cop, immediately move to blame the police officer without knowing the facts, without knowing what happened. It's always the officer. The incredibly reckless push to abolish the police that is driven by the left wing of the Democratic Party, I believe, has done enormous damage. And President Biden nominated not one, but two of the leading advocates of abolishing the police to be senior officials at the U.S. Department of Justice, Vanita Gupta and Kristen Clark. For both of them, they had repeatedly, explicitly, vigorously argued for defunding or abolishing the police. And every single Democratic senator voted to confirm both of them. So Democrat politicians in an election season say they don't support defunding the police, but when given a chance to decide, should one of the leading advocates of defunding the police be the number 3 person at the Department of Justice, 100% of Senate Democrats said, A-OK with me. Sergeant Penny, share for this committee what the effect of the rhetoric directed at police officers has been to the men and women in the field, to the men and women risking their lives to keep us safe.
It's been demoralizing for our officers in the field, the officers that's trying to work hard to keep us safe. We just got to go back to the July 7, 2016 shooting attack and look at how the rise of anti-police sentiment was being used to incite violence against police. That actually radicalized an individual to come into downtown Dallas to shoot multiple people and kill 5 police officers. And those of you that have never seen a shooting before, it's even worse to imagine the carnage that happened on that day. To see the officers coming into the hospital and being wheeled in over and over again, one after the other. And Senator, you were there. America needs to understand that these are real lives. Officers are people too. They're here to do a difficult job, and they just want to go home to their families. But we cannot allow this irresponsible rhetoric that's being used to proliferate radical messages online to incite violence against police, because individuals are taking up arms and actually carrying out those attacks. So I encourage everyone, Senator, to be responsible, especially our leaders for this country. Be responsible in what they're putting out online, because it's endangering our lives. Thank you.
Well, Sergeant Petty, that is powerful, and I agree with you. You're right, I was at the funeral for the 5 police officers in Dallas. It was horrific. In that instance, the gunman told police negotiators, quote, he was upset about Black Lives Matter, and, quote, he was upset about the recent police shootings, and that he was upset at white people. The suspect stated he wanted to kill white people, especially white officers. that vicious rhetoric, the false lies. We had a Biden judicial nominee testify, sitting at that table you're at, that police officers shoot unarmed black men in America every single week. It's a flat-out lie. It's completely false, and yet the Senate Judiciary Committee was the vehicle for spreading that lie. It's harmful. It's harmful when politicians throw gas on the fire, and it's particularly harmful when the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, bails out of jail violent Black Lives Matter and Antifa rioters siding with the criminals instead of the cops. Sheriff Bouchard, what does that do to the men and women of blue that are keeping us safe?
Well, thank you, Senator. In many ways, as was said, it demoralizes when you see people that have attacked police or have heard police get out on little or no bail. And I have often likened it to the similarity when our Vietnam vets came home, they were spit on and they were demonized, and they were men and women that were going to do a tough job that they were asked to do and then demonized for doing it. I think we pledged as a society we're not going to let that happen to our veterans again. Amen. So happy that happened. We're in the same place right now with police, and we're letting history repeat itself. We're letting good men and women that are out there doing a tough job get demonized and demoralized.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have no further requests for questions. I'd like to make a few comments for the record. The Senate Judiciary Committee has passed 5 bipartisan bills. We're trying to keep this as bipartisan as possible. I know at moments it didn't sound like it, but we're trying to keep this as bipartisan as possible. We passed 5 bipartisan bills out of committee that provide resources and funding to enhance officer recruitment and retention and address mental health challenges. The Invest to Protect Act by Senators Cortez Masto and Grassley, dedicating $250 million of COPS grants funding for 5 years to support smaller law enforcement agencies. The Fighting Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Act of 2022, Senator Coons of Delaware and Senator Grassley, directing the Attorney General to develop programs to treat, prevent job-related post-traumatic stress disorder. Strong Communities Act, Senators Peters and Cornyn, providing COPS grants for local law enforcement recruits to attend law enforcement training. The Law Enforcement De-Escalation Training Act, Cornyn and Whitehouse. Public Safety Officer Support Act, Duckworth and Cornyn. The point I'm trying to make to you is, despite some who would like to turn this into a partisan fight, there is strong bipartisan support, as there should be, for the men and women in law enforcement. This is not a partisan issue from this committee's point of view. That is, when Senator Grassley asked me for this hearing, I did not object to it. It was within my control. He's my friend and I trust him, and he makes a very, very valuable contribution on his side of the aisle as I try to make on mine. You've seen several of the members of the committee who raised the question about appointments by the Biden administration. One, Vanita Gupta. She comes up at every hearing from the other side of the table. I want you to know that Vanita Gupta's position at the Department of Justice was supported by the Fraternal Order of Police, National Sheriff's Association, Major Cities Chiefs, and the International Association of Chiefs of Police. Does this sound like someone who's an enemy of the police? The other woman, Kristen Clark, in the Civil Rights section, supported by the International Association of Chiefs of Police, Major Cities Chiefs, Noble, NAPO, and many more. So there's always a little bit more to the story than you just might hear in the testimony here. But I want to thank you all. I can't thank you enough for what you've done with your lives and what you've really decided to do to protect others. It's something that none of us can really say enough for. But thanks for coming today. Usually this testimony is reserved for Police Week, but there is so much controversy and so many comments that have been made today that are timely as of now and will continue to be. This, as far as I'm concerned, from the committee's point of view, is a year-round assignment. It's not 1 week each year. It's a year-round assignment. I want to particularly thank Ms. French for coming. I asked her to, and she was kind enough to come so we could pay honor and tribute to your wonderful daughter. And to the others, Chief Navales, thank you from the Chicago side of things, and all of you. Officer Anderson, I could tell how much this means to you personally. Commissioner Harrison, thank you too. You've been on the firing line, literally, for all of your professional life. Sergeant Penny as well, thank you again. And Chief Henninger, when you told the story of your own personal experience with your partner, it really is something I'll remember. Sheriff Bouchard, you've had an amazing career, both in elective office and appointive office. And your list of accomplishments are too many pages. You're going to have to condense it into a smaller group. But thank you all for coming. You may get a few questions for the record, doubtful, but possible if you receive them, if you could answer in a timely timetable that works with you, I should say. We mostly appreciate that too. So thank you very much, and this meeting of the Senate Judiciary Committee will stand adjourned.